Hello, and thank you for listening to the Testing the Spirits podcast. In this episode, we're going to be talking about a very serious topic, and that is the subject of sheep stealing. Sheep stealing. What is that? It's when one pastor tries to get someone to leave their church and go to his church. So if I approach someone who went to a different church, I said, "Why don't you leave and come attend my congregation?" Well, that would be sheep stealing, and that would be unethical. Every pastor I've ever talked to about this, every pastor I've ever heard discussing this, everyone seems to agree sheep stealing is wrong. It is unethical. And this has been done with some of the larger mega churches. There's a practice called geofencing. So if they can somehow get your data from your cell phone, that if you have been near a church or you attend a smaller church, they can get your information. And those are the people that the large mega churches will target. And the whole point is for them to try to, through advertising, get you to leave your small local Bible-believing church and come to their large mega church. So I think I did a YouTube short on that. But this isn't something you hear about a lot. This was more of a concern, I think, back in the 1970s, 1980s. A lot of pastors, older pastors I've talked to have said this was a real concern back in the day. That's why people were hesitant doing events with other churches. They were afraid of sheep stealing because apparently some pastors would put on events, and the whole point of them putting, or at least so people thought, the whole point of putting on this event and getting other churches to attend is to try to lure the sheep away from this other church to come there. Well, that doesn't seem right, certainly, if that's your motivation. But when a pastor just flat out asks someone, "Hey, leave your church and come to my church," that's wrong. That's wrong. Now, someone will say, "Where's that in the Bible? Give me chapter and verse as to where that's wrong." Well, here's the problem. It would have been impossible in the first century. When the Bible was being written, this was impossible because back then there was only one church per city. So you had the churches in Galatia that were all spread out. You had the church in Antioch, the church in Jerusalem. The pastor or leaders from one church, what are they going to say? "Hey, why don't you walk 180 miles to my church on Sunday?" And that just wasn't possible in the first century. Again, there was only one church per city, or sometimes one church per region. So yeah, there was no sheep stealing in the first century, although the false prophets would try to draw the disciples away, after themselves. And I don't mean to imply, to be clear, that pastors who engage in sheep stealing, "Hey, leave your church and come to my church." I am not saying that makes someone a false prophet or a false teacher, but it is unethical. Okay, it is unethical. So this is a problem, and maybe it's happened to you, maybe it hasn't, maybe it's happened to people in your congregation. People leave churches sometimes. Why do they leave? There sometimes are legitimate reasons to leave. If a church is going bad, I would say this: the only time it's acceptable to tell someone to leave their church and maybe come to my church or come to a good church over here, the only time that would be acceptable is if they were part of an apostate church. I can think of a circumstance in my area. There was a Baptist church that used to preach the gospel, but then they started going into the rainbow direction. And yeah, if a pastor said, "Hey, you need to leave that church. They're going in the wrong direction. You need to leave. And, you can come here." Even then, it's a little sketchy to say, "Leave and come to my church." But the advice would be, yeah, leave and go to a good church. So yes, telling someone to leave a church when the church is going bad, that would be the exception if it's actually going apostate. But just asking someone to leave their church and come to your church, especially, and I realize church members might do that. "Hey, why don't you come here?" And that's not what we're talking about. Now, maybe we could discuss that. I'm talking about pastors. Pastors should know better. So sheep stealing is when a pastor says, leave your church and come to my church. Okay. So has this ever happened? I have never asked somebody to leave their church and come to my church. There have been maybe 2 or 3 people who have been conflicted. Should I go here? Should I go there? I've always told them, hey, make a decision one way or another. Whether you come here, great. If you go to the other church, if it's a good church, just be committed to one or the other. So I have done that. There have been people who have left their church and come to my church, just like there's been people who have left my church and gone to other churches. And as long as you're not leaving on bad terms, depending on the reasons, like I said, there are reasons. It is okay. You don't have to attend this fellowship or that fellowship. People, sometimes it's maybe even the right choice to leave. So I want to be clear about that. But anytime someone has left their church and come to my church, I've always tried to do my due diligence. And I've asked them, did you leave on bad terms? Is everything okay? Like, I ask questions and I try to make sure that everything's on the up and up. And I would never ask someone, hey, leave your congregation and come here. Again, it's wrong. It's wrong. There was one example, actually it happened recently, where someone left their church and they showed up at my church, and I actually told them, you can't attend here, because they were actually asked to leave their church. I said, you need to go back and fix the problem at your previous congregation. You left on bad terms. They asked you to leave. I don't think it was an officially a discipline excommunication type of a thing. But certainly if someone was excommunicated at a church and they just showed up at our congregation, that's not above board. But they weren't excommunicated. They just showed up. And I said, no, you need to go back to your church and resolve that issue before, once you resolve the issue and everything's fine, then maybe we can talk. But no, this is very important. The Apostle Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, let all things be done decently and in order. And there's plenty of Bible verses that talk about honesty and integrity. And I'm just going to end the podcast by saying this, that sheep stealing is unethical. It's wrong. Again, every pastor I've ever talked to about it, every pastor who's ever discussed it, when I've been in their presence and heard it, like, everyone seems to agree, sheep stealing is not okay. Again, the only exception is when a church is going apostate. If they're in the process, if someone's going to an apostate church, or their church is in the process of going apostate, then yes, tell them to leave. But even then, saying, come to my church, then it seems like you might have ulterior motives. So it would be better to say, just make sure you find a good church. But yeah, this is a serious topic. And obviously, we talk about stepping on people's toes. Well, if you're trying to steal another pastor's sheep, you're not just stepping on his toes, you're stomping on his toes and then kind of spitting at him. So this is a bad thing, and we should be on the lookout for it. But again, it's pastors doing it. We're talking about pastors, and pastors certainly should know better. So that's all for today. Thank you for listening, and until next time, may the Lord be with you, and have a great day.